Hello, my name is Luca van Duren and welcome to this presentation on assessing ecosystem effects of large-scale implementation of offshore wind farms. I'm giving this presentation on behalf of a large number of colleagues, both from Deltaris, as well as from Wageningen Marine Research and the Royal Netherlands Institute for Sea Research. The projected upscaling of offshore wind on the North Sea is very large. To the right, you see a map from a marine consultant showing the current wind farms that are currently in a planning stage, and also search areas of different countries on the North Sea. The Netherlands is actually currently searching for more search areas in this economic zone. In a desk study we performed a couple of years ago, we showed that building a large number of turbines could cause ecosystem effects quite different from collision risks with birds and bats or noise. Large number of offshore wind farms can potentially change physical processes such as currents, waves, and fine sediment dynamics, affecting basic ecosystem functioning of the North Sea. If we look at interaction between wind turbines and both wind and water, we have a fairly good understanding of what happens around a single turbine or between turbines within a wind farm. But we know far less of the larger scale, say the scale of the southern North Sea. Looking at wind, we know that under certain circumstances, their wakes can be visible for many kilometers behind a farm. And as wind drives waves, and waves drive resuspension of sediment, it's certainly possible that with large upscaling, there can be effects at the scale of an ecosystem. Another process that the desk study identified as potentially important is stratification. Now, this might require a bit of explanation. If you are in an area with a fully mixed water column, oxygen, nutrients, fine sediment and also phytoplankton can mix quite easily from the surface to the bed and vice versa. Now, in some areas, you can get a situation where you have density differences between layers of water, so warmer or less saline water can float on a layer of colder or saltier water, and these layers don't mix very much. So oxygen and phytoplankton, which are produced in the surface, do not easily reach the bed, and nutrients can get trapped in the bottom layers. In the North Sea, there are different areas with different stratification regimes. The red ones in the figure on the right are always stratified. The green ones are stratified in summer but not in winter. The yellow ones are under the influence of fresh water and have salinity stratification, while the blue areas are always mixed and the purple and white areas have either an unclear regime or an intermittent stratification regime. Now, the process of stratification is very important for many processes in the ecosystem. Humans can have direct as well as indirect effects on the ecosystem. For instance, offshore wind will interact directly with wind and currents and waves, and the scour protection will change the bed. This has a subsequent knock-on effect on the transport of nutrients and fine sediment, and subsequently on the whole food web. Up to a certain level, we can model these effects at least to some detail. However, there's no model that can model the whole North Sea food web with all the species in it. The problem is that most of the policy targets are geared towards the top predators, such as marine mammals and birds. So the WOZEP programme has adopted a two-tiered approach, a bottom-up one, where we try with deterministic models to assess the size of the effects, and that's this presentation. And in parallel, there is a top-down approach, which will be presented by Jaap van der Meer from Wageningen Marine Research. And this really looks at these higher level species such as birds, marine mammals, and some of the fish species, and look at how they are influenced throughout the food web. The bottom-up approach uses a modelling suite with 3 different types of models: a hydrodynamics model, fine sediment model, and a water quality and ecology model. The reason that we chose this modelling suite, which is actually quite new, and this is the first time the whole modelling suite with all 3 components are used in tandem, is that the hydrodynamics model is extremely good at modelling stratification. What you see in the figure on the right, on the starry dot in the top left figure, that's the location on the oyster grounds where we have measurements from the top layer and the bottom layer in terms of temperature. The bottom figure indicates the temperature differences between top and bottom, and the red one is a measurement, and the blue one is the simulation. And you see that these two match each other remarkably well, and that's really what you need for this type of research. These three models can be online coupled. So there is a fine sediment model to model turbidity. And in the ecological module, we can simulate the growth of algae, so primary production, as well as the growth of shellfish on the bed and on turbines. This is the very first time that this modelling suite has been used in completion, and we had to make a few simplifications. First of all, we have reduced the wind within the wind farms by about 10%, but we haven't been able to model the wakes yet, so the wakes in the wind behind the wind farms. And also in this first exercise, the fine sediment model and the ecological model are not yet fully online coupled. The aim of this exercise was to get a first impression if ecosystem effects in the North Sea due to the rollout of offshore wind are really relevant, and also to see which parts of the North Sea are more susceptible to such changes than others. For this project, we have modelled three different scenarios. First of all, a reference scenario with no wind farms present at all in the North Sea. Secondly, what we call a 2020 scenario, that's with the wind farms which were operational present in the North Sea in 2020 in the model. And last but not least, a hypothetical upscaling scenario. Now, this is not meant to be a realistic scenario. It is a scenario that is designed to learn as much as possible from the effects of wind farms. It's partially based on the projections of the offshore wind industry on the amount of wind they want to harvest in about 2020. And we have used, of course, the areas that are known to be designated as wind farm areas. But for the areas that weren't known yet, we have placed them in areas such as partially stratified on frontal areas, in seasonally stratified or non-stratified areas, just to learn as much as possible. Each of these wind farms can have different dimensions. The orange ones, so the ones that are currently operational, we know that the current wind farms, the turbines are smaller. So these are 5 meters, the support structures are 5 meters in diameter, and there are 3.2 turbines per square kilometre. The ones in red, that's the ones for which there are already concessions or are already under construction. These are 8 meters in diameter and 0.9 turbines per square kilometre. And the future ones, we had to make a few guesses, and we dimensioned them at 12 meters in diameter of the support structure and 0.7 turbines per square kilometre. Again, it's probably not realistic, but these are the assumptions we've made so far. You are going to see a number of pictures, maps in a minute, and in these maps you see the difference between the scenario, either the 2020 scenario or the upscaling scenario, minus the reference scenario. So you only see the effect of the wind farms. And most of the presentation focuses on the upscaling scenario, apart from the results from the hydrodynamics model. Now, these are the first results of the hydrodynamics model, and these are the effects on the residual currents, so not the maximum peak velocities that you have in the system, but the residual currents. This is the 2020 scenario, and what you see is a reduction of currents within the wind farm, as you would expect, because the wind farms exert a drag on the flow. In many places immediately adjacent to the wind farms, you can see some increase in flow velocity. Generally, the effects are restricted to the wind farm area and the immediate surroundings. That is quite different in the upscaling scenario, where you see, again, a significant reduction within the wind farms, and in most cases, an increase in flow velocity surrounding the wind farms, but the effects reach far beyond the wind farms themselves. Then the results on stratification. First, the 2020 scenario. First, we see some effect on temperature stratification. The pictures you see here are temperature stratification, not salinity stratification. You see effects in the German Bight and in some of the English wind farms. And you wouldn't expect to see anything further south because the areas where you find wind farms there are generally not stratified, certainly no temperature stratification. What you see here is that the effects are generally limited to the immediate surroundings of the wind farms and the wind farms themselves. That is quite different in the upscaling scenario, where first of all you see very distinct effects in areas such as the oyster grounds, which is the seasonally stratified area. And also what you see is that effects on stratification extend well beyond the limits of the wind farms. For fine sediment, what we found was that the fine sediment model that we had was very good at producing the fine sediment patterns that you find in the North Sea. But initially, this had a bit of a bias as it predicted fine sediment concentrations in the water column that were too low. This has meanwhile been fixed, but that was one of the reasons that the fine sediment model couldn't be coupled directly to the ecological model, as you would expect to predict far too high primary production then, because light limitation would be not well represented. What you will see in the next pictures are the relative effects, so percentage changes in the fine sediment amounts in the water column, in the top and in the bottom. And because we show relative effects, so in terms of percentages, this bias shouldn't really affect our conclusions. The model results of the upscaling scenario indicate that in nearly all the wind farms there's an increase of fine sediment concentrations in the top layers in and around the wind farms. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is everywhere more sediment in the water column. The wind farms can influence several processes. For instance, they can influence the amount of sediment that is in the water column, so there can be more or less resuspension. They can influence the composition of fine sediment, so more or fewer larger particles, which will change the influence on light distribution. And also the distribution of already suspended sediment in the water column can change. Now, particularly the latter appears to be the case in quite a few wind farms. Normally, fine sediment concentrations are higher near the bed than near the surface. Not in all, but in quite a few wind farms, the upscaling scenario shows more fine sediment in the top, but lower concentrations near the bed. That means that there's not so much more sediment in suspension, but it's distributed differently. Along the Holland coast, there is a residual current, resulting in a net northward transport of fine sediment. In the upscaling scenario, we found that the transport rates across these various transects that you see on the left-hand side, that these were reduced. This is a consequence of several processes. First of all, in the near coast areas, the total concentration in suspension is a bit less. And also there are changes in the way the Rhine is mixed into the North Sea water. So that results in changes in vertical mixing and in horizontal mixing. Eventually, this may have an effect on the rate of transport of fine sediment towards the Wadden Sea. Now, the current scenario, of course, is one single scenario, and we see the cumulative effect of all the wind farms together. So we don't know yet at the moment what the contribution is of individual wind farms. It's of course likely that the farms such as Borssele and those in the Holland coast are very important for this, and probably together with some of the Belgian farms and some of the English farms. Regarding primary production, due to the fact that the fine sediment model has a bias and gives concentrations that were a bit too low, we couldn't couple these models directly. So we initially ran the different scenarios with fine sediment fields from an older, very well calibrated model. In these runs, you see the effects of the changes in currents and stratification, but the fine sediment stays the same in the reference and in the upscaling scenario. So we see very large effects in the areas such as the oyster grounds and the German bights. In these areas, we saw significant effects on stratification. The extra mixing causes more nutrients to be available in the top layers, boosting production. On an annual basis, in some areas, this can amount to more than 60% increase in primary production. If you only consider the spring period, this is even more pronounced. In some of the areas, primary production is increased with about 75%. So the model runs on the previous slide, they did not take into account the effect of changes in fine sediment. In order to get a bit of an impression of the combined effect of fine sediment and hydrodynamics, we also performed some model runs on a slightly coarser grid, where we changed the fine sediment concentration in the top layers with the same ratio as the SBM models indicated. In this figure, you see in the red areas where fine sediment in the top layer was increased and in the blue areas where it was decreased. The results are as follows. On the left, you see the model as before with only the changes in hydrodynamics. And on the right, you see the combination, so with the effects of fine sediment included. On the whole, the pattern appears to be fairly similar, so the effects of fine sediment appear to be limited, certainly in the central part of the North Sea. But there are effects in the Holland coast and in the German bight. There you see effects of increasing fine sediment in the top layers, and it does decrease primary productivity there. Apart from a change in the amount of productivity, there's also another important effect that can have consequences for higher trophic levels. Not only the level of stratification is affected in certain areas, but also the timing of the onset of summer stratification is delayed. This results in a delay in the peak of the spring bloom. On the left, you see two graphs. In the top one, you see a graph from an area in the Holland coast where you have hardly any stratification. The bottom one is a graph from the oyster grounds where you have seasonal stratification. The black lines are the reference scenario, the blue lines are the upscaling scenario. And you see that in the Holland coast, there isn't a huge amount of difference between the two lines, but particularly in the oyster grounds, you see a shift backwards of 2 weeks in the peak of the spring bloom. In the German bight, where you have not only the effect of changes in stratification, but you also have effect of increased fine sediment in the top layers, this delay in the spring bloom is even more. It's delayed by about 4 weeks there. This figure is a summary of the effects that we found in our models of offshore wind farms on the North Sea ecosystem. The green area is the central southern North Sea, and that is the area that is normally seasonally stratified, so stratified in summer and not in winter. And this is the area where we found the largest effects. These effects were generally due to the relaxation of stratification. The area is relatively deep and we saw very little increase in fine sediment in the top layers. So in general, in this area, the primary production was increased, although the onset of the spring bloom was delayed. The German bight, which is a pink area, that is by far the most complex area. It shows a weak stratification regime, which is due to both changes in differences in temperature and differences in salinity in the top and bottom layers. And this area also sees effects of fine sediment in the top layers. The combination of the two leads to quite a strong delay in the spring bloom. The blue area, so the UK coast and the western part of the Dutch continental shelf, that is an area which is normally not stratified at all. So extra mixing here by wind farms doesn't really result in a change in production. But this area does have some wind farms where we have an increase in fine sediment in the top layers, which reduces primary production slightly. The yellow area is the Holland coast and the region of freshwater influence of the Rhine. So this area is nearly always somewhat stratified, but generally due to changes in salinity. And in this area, because of the influx of very high nutrient nutrient-rich water from the Rhine, which comes in the top layer of the water column, we don't see any changes in productivity due to changes in stratification, but we do see some changes in productivity due to an increased fine sediment concentration in the top layer of the water. The orange part, that's the North Sea part along the Danish and the German Wadden coast. This is in many respects very, very similar to the blue area, and actually the delineation between the two is quite vague. And the brown area, that is the Dogger Bank, which is a shallow area in the middle of the North Sea. It's surrounded by a strongly seasonally stratified area, and parts of the Dogger Bank are sometimes stratified, but quite often not. So effects of stratification are very limited. And because the Dogger Bank is generally consists of fairly coarse material and there is not a huge amount of fine sediment in the water, actually the effects of wind farms in that area are quite limited. So the conclusions that we can draw from these first modelling exercises are that at least the new modelling suite that we have used is very promising for this type of work. At the moment, it's still in a state of development. There are some improvements to be made and it has to be validated properly, but it certainly has the potential to develop into a policy support tool. The effects that we saw in the green areas on the previous slide, so the seasonally stratified areas, they were actually a wee bit larger than we had expected up front. Because these changes were the result of changes in stratification, and these are modelled with a hydrodynamic part of the model, these results we think are quite robust. The hydrodynamic model has been validated much more extensively and has been much more extensively used than the other parts of the model. The German Bight is by far the most complex area, and in this area at the moment we see a negative effect on primary production, so a suppression of primary production, but really for this area we are very careful with the results and we really need the coupled models as well as the inclusion of the wind wakes to assess this properly. It looks like that in some parts of the North Sea, so particularly the German Bight and the seasonally stratified area, which is a fairly large chunk of the North Sea, that the effects are such that we expect to see also effects for the higher trophic levels. At the moment, there is still quite a gap between the modelling of the primary production and looking what sort of effect that might have on animals with a high level of conservation status, for instance, such as gannets and marine mammals and other animals. And that gap is particularly zooplankton and fish. So this is something that needs to have attention in the near future. So we have planned the next steps in this research, and the follow-up work that has been planned is for the short term. We have already made some improvements in the fine sediment model, so that bias that we saw, that is something that we've already dealt with, and the next step will be the full coupling with the ecological modelling. And also in this, with this model, we need to assess the transport of fine sediment along the Dutch coast. Furthermore, we will include the effect of growth of mussels on the turbines, so high in the water columns, as this is something that is likely to affect the distribution of phytoplankton throughout the water column. We have already performed the validation of fine sediment and the ecological model on the reference scenario, where we do need to validate these models on the effect of the wind farms. We have contacted some colleagues in Germany who have measurements on stratification in and surrounding wind farms in the German Bight, and these data we hope to be able to use in the near future. We will also start making adjustments to the wave modelling and include the effects of the wind wakes behind the farms, and to that extent we have contacted some other groups including KNMI. And we intend to include zooplankton in the model based on the same modelling framework as what we use for shellfish. And last but not least, and I think that's really the most important thing that we need to do, is to close the gap between the changes that we see at the base of the food web and the birds of and the mammals that have the high conservation status. With this modelling suite, it should be possible to investigate specific wind farm scenarios in future. For instance, the effect of large continuous wind farms versus smaller patchy farms, changes in turbine sizes and spacing, or the orientation of farms in relation to the main currents to assess configurations that have minimal negative effects. These model runs can also be coupled to knowledge that we have of the food landscape and migration routes of birds and marine mammals and other animals in the North Sea. The models can also be used to look at the interaction effects of wind farms in relation to climate change, and of course to assess the effects of offshore wind in conjunction with other forms of marine energy such as offshore solar, and changes in human use of the North Sea such as aquaculture and restoration and conservation efforts. This is the end of my presentation. I thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions about this, you can either contact me directly or you can contact the WOZEP team at Rijkswaterstaat. Thank you very much.